Professor Avalos?
Well, I've done a lot of work on pro-slavery advocacy in the South. And when he says that this idea of natural selection is really Darwinist, I guess he hasn't read enough of this pro-slavery racialist literature in the American South. So let me just quote a couple of items which show that certainly this idea that the strong should dispossess the weak and oppress the weak is not really a Darwinist idea. Here is an example from 1850, which would be before 1859, from Robert Knox. Robert Knox was a racialist writer, Scottish, and he said this in a book called The Races of Man. Quote, "Now whether the earth be overpopulated or not, one thing is certain, the strong will always grasp at the property and lands of the weak. I have been assured that this is compatible with the highest moral, even Christian feeling." So even if it were the case that a lot of these people thought natural law, natural selection favored the strong, they found it compatible with Christianity. They found no incompatibility, and the same goes for Hitler. Hitler was a creationist. He thought that natural law was created by God, and that this natural law was supposed to result in the extermination of the weak, because that's what racialist literature in the American South also said before Darwin. Here's a second example from George Fitzhugh, an American pro-slavery advocate. You can find it in the antebellum writings of George Fitzhugh, 1854, so before 1859, and he says this, quote, "Members of Congress of the Young American Party boast that the Anglo-Saxon race is manifestly destined to eat out all other races, as the wiregrass destroys and takes the place of other grasses." Well, that sounds a lot like natural selection to me, where naturally stronger species will replace weaker species or weaker groups. That has nothing to do with Darwinism necessarily, and the population issues he mentioned, he knows well. Those are not Darwinists. They go back to Thomas Malthus. And so, again, he is ascribing to Darwinism, especially in The Origin of Species. That's how he defines it. The Origin of Species book. Nothing in there about exterminating Jews, but you do find it in Luther. And incredibly, Hitler says Luther is one of his heroes, not Darwin.
I'll take a break at this point. We'll come back in a moment. You just heard the voice of Professor Hector Avalos from ISU. And we're also in the middle of this is a formal debate, folks. I'm not involved except trying to keep the time here. Dr. Richard Weikart is on the other side of the aisle. He is from Discovery Institute. Professor Avalos is from ISU. Back in a moment, right after Ken Root updates us on our farm market.
For delicious news.
I can't remember ever doing a formal debate on this program before. We're doing one now, though. Dr. Richard Weikart represents Discovery Institute's Center for Science and Culture. His book is called From Darwin to Hitler. In the studio with us, representing himself, and who is a representative of ISU, prolific writer and critic of intelligent design and creationism, is Dr. Hector Avalos. Dr. Richard Weikart, it is your turn, sir.
Okay, Professor Avalos quoted from a number of racial thinkers before Darwin's time and claimed that somehow this disproves my idea that these are Darwinian ideas. It doesn't at all. Darwin incorporated many ideas of racist thinkers of his time into his thinking about race in The Descent of Man. I'm sorry that Professor Avalos doesn't like me quoting from The Descent of Man, which is Darwin's major book about human evolution, written after The Origin, but it certainly had a huge impact on people, and Darwin was applying natural selection and evolution to the human species. And he does, and I quoted earlier from that piece, a part that said, quote, "At some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace throughout the world the savage races." Now, Darwin wasn't saying we should go out and kill people, but he was saying that this was a natural process, and it is part of his theory, not just the theory of racist thinkers before him. Yes, it was. There were racist thinkers that put forward the idea before him, but that doesn't make it a non-Darwinian idea, and Darwin does explain it quite thoroughly. Also, I've examined in great detail in my book From Darwin to Hitler and elsewhere the racial thinkers of the late 19th and early 20th century that would have influenced Nazi ideology. People like Ludwig Boltzmann, Ludwig Schemann, who is the leader of the Gobineau Society, Theodor Fritsch, and I could give dozens of other names of leading racial thinkers in Germany who very overtly drew upon Darwinism, claimed to be synthesizing Darwinism into their racial thinking, who used the idea of natural selection and overpopulation, population pressure, and Professor Avalos even mentioned Malthus a little bit ago. I'm not sure if he realizes this, but Darwin very overtly said that Malthus was where he got his idea for natural selection. So to say that something is an idea from Malthus does not mean it's non-Darwinian. In fact, it means it is Darwinian. And Darwin was drawing upon Malthus. So just to say that it's a Malthusian idea does not mean it's not a Darwinian idea as well. Professor Avalos has never yet talked about any of the racial thinkers of the period that Hitler could have been reading and that many of his contemporaries were reading to try to show that they were not influenced by Darwinism, which they were. To be sure, there was still influence of Christian anti-Judaism. I already conceded this at the very start. Christian anti-Judaism was an influence on Nazi ideology. I've never denied such a thing, but he doesn't seem aware that Darwinism was a huge influence on anti-Semitism and racial thought. And he also has never addressed any of the other issues that I raised about Nazi eugenics policies, about the living space idea, and many other key aspects of Nazi ideology that had a lot to do with Darwinism but had absolutely nothing to do with Christian anti-Judaism. I'll get to the issue of Hitler being a creationist in one of my later responses, I hope, which is also a very fanciful claim. Hitler was not a creationist, and I can prove that.